we put together work. He got me involved in the work on the Great Sphinx and redating the Great Sphinx. And now this ties in with other sites, other evidence for civilization, advanced civilization at a much earlier period. When I first got involved in this, the classic notion, which is really still the classic academic notion in the status quo circles, is that civilization first arises in Mesopotamia, slightly later in Egypt, in particular those two regions, maybe a little bit later in the Far East, about 3500 BC. So around that period, 2500 BC is the classical date for the origins of the Sphinx, de novo. More or less, it was carved from scratch from the bedrock at 2500 BC. This began to fall apart for me, this paradigm, in 1990 when I first actually went to Egypt in real life, should we say, not just studying it from books, that type of thing, or photographs, but actually went there to investigate. And I've been there many, many times since. But I went there. There's John West and myself. This was taken in 2016. I went there at the invitation of John Anthony West, specifically to investigate from a geological point of view, how old is the Sphinx? And ultimately, it led to us developing not just the Sphinx work, but taking it much further than that. And we were first introduced by a colleague at Boston University because John Anthony West was looking for, as he referred to it, an open-minded geologist who would actually look at this issue. It turns out, I was amazed that no one had really looked into it before. It was one of these things, and this is important, I believe, that different disciplines in academia tend not to talk to each other too much. So the Egyptologists, they study things like the Sphinx. The geologists might study Eocene rocks, which is what the Sphinx is carved out of, limestones, but they don't actually apply their expertise to the Sphinx. Just to orient you a little bit, do you see the Sphinx? Circled there. This is the Great Pyramid, second pyramid, third pyramid here. It sits due east. This is a picture from 1930-ish. This is a picture I took a number of years ago. This shows that the Sphinx, only the head actually stood above the level of the plateau initially. The body, to carve the body, they actually cut down into the bedrock. Also notice, does the Sphinx's head look a little small for you? It's not the original head. It is a recarved head. I'm absolutely certain of that. It's a recarved head, and when you recarve something, it's going to get smaller. This is young me. I don't know if you can recognize me. Young me with my field book and jacket, but I'm in the Sphinx enclosure looking at the erosional patterns. Bottom line is that I have no doubt, I had no doubt at the time, and I have no doubt to this day, in fact, it's only been reconfirmed for me as I've studied it more and more, that this is evidence of precipitation, rainfall, running over the rocks, beating down on the rocks, causing these types of rounded, what I call rounded rolling features. You can see this in the diagram here. And very importantly, cutting these fissures. Now, yes, these fissures are along weak zones in the rock, but they are cut by rainfall runoff. The problem for the Egyptologists is that this area, here you can see the Sphinx in its enclosure, this area has been hyper-arid. It's been Sahara Desert for the last 5,000 years. If the Sphinx was only carved 4,500 years ago, how can this be the case? So immediately, and when I say immediately, I mean when I first went to Egypt in 1990, my first trip there, I said there was something amiss with the geology and the chronology. There had to be an explanation for this. So just looking at it a little bit more, I do want to point out that's young me and John Anthony West. This is due to rainfall runoff. There's a lot of diagnostic features of rainfall runoff off, including scalloping and whatnot along the edge here, the vertical fissures. Sometimes people think it's due to Nile flooding. No, it's not. Nile floods, yes, did sometimes come up to the paws of the Sphinx and around the base. I'm aware of that. Very rarely, but there's records of that occurring. When I say rarely, I'm speaking as a geologist. That's occurred in modern times too, but then you've got problems with the Aswan Dam and the rising water tables, etc. If this were Nile flooding, or as some people have suggested, if they actually filled this in with water to make a moat around the Sphinx, it would not give this form of weathering and erosional features. I don't want to beat that into the ground now, but I just want people to be aware. I've certainly looked at such things. We did seismic work around the Sphinx. More or less, we used a sledgehammer on a steel plate. This is Boris Said. This is Thomas DeBecke, a geophysicist who was working with us at the time. This is the early 1990s. John Anthony West, the subject of study, the Sphinx. My young me, and what we found is that we had uneven weathering around the Sphinx. What this suggests, doesn't just suggest, I mean, it's very evident to me, the Sphinx was actually carved out initially on 3 sides. Then it was later fully carved in the back. This level of weathering, which is much more shallow in the back, is compatible with and compares well with the subsurface mineralogical changes, so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about subsurface weathering, that we have for other Old Kingdom, dynastic, 4th dynasty tombs and structures that are supposedly contemporaneous with the original Sphinx. Does everyone follow? The fact that you have much, much deeper weathering around the other 3 sites indicates that this was carved out earlier. The body was carved out earlier. And actually what happens when you look there is that initially, you see how you have the older weathering here? The Sphinx was only carved down to this point approximately initially, so it emerged out of the bedrock, and then I believe in the 4th dynasty, about 2500 BC, they were not carving the Sphinx originally, they were recarving parts of it, including the head, sometime in dynastic times, along the back, etc. So initially, the Sphinx actually emerged from the bedrock, which is interesting because in the age of Leo, about 10,000 BC, when the Sphinx sits due east, at that time in the age of Leo, what rose on the horizon due east on the vernal equinox? The constellation Leo. And when you view it from this vantage point, arguably it rises that way with the rump. You see how the rump sort of attaches to the horizon initially as it comes up. Now, I am not basing my dating on Leo and when Leo rose, but I think it's interesting that it's compatible and seems to tie in with my dating. My dating currently for the core portion of the Sphinx, the core body of the Sphinx, is about 10,000 BC. Why? What I've done is calibrate how quickly, or slowly I should say, the subsurface weathering will take place. So it's really based, the core dating for me is based primarily on the seismic evidence and calibrating that. And you can read about that if you want to in Origins of the Sphinx. I'll show a picture of that book in shortly. And I'm not pushing, I'm just saying that's where you get more information on this, but it ties in and seems to be corroborated by a number of other lines of evidence, including that we might be talking about the age of Leo. So we did other work. This is another seismic map. This is showing structures under the Sphinx. We were not looking for structures under the Sphinx. I was actually looking for subsurface mineralogical changes, weathering. But we found some structures. We found a chamber or cavity under the rump here. It turns out the ancient Egyptians, the modern Egyptologists knew about that. We didn't know about when we found it, but they said they knew about it, so that confirmed that the seismic work was good. We also found sort of a linear feature here, which is probably, I think, a collapsed tunnel type feature. But most importantly, we found a chamber under the left paw. Do you see this? This is the map of the Sphinx. So you're looking down on it, and this is her left paw. Everyone see? And so we found this chamber underneath this. And this was really interesting because could this, even back then we speculate, could this be an archive from Zep Tepi? Could it be an archive from, quote, Atlantis? I hate to use that term. Or could it be archived at least from that earlier civilization, that earlier advanced period? That was bad enough to be finding something like that and maybe speculating about it. Back in those days, I would not say the A word publicly. And the A word was, for me, it was Atlantis. Forget about alien. but Atlantis, I still don't say the second one. Right? No, because I'm not, I'm very, I don't know, academic, yeah. Well, that's an A word too, isn't it? Now that I think of it. Anyway, getting back, just having fun with it now. Getting back to it, it did not help me that this man, who is this? Edgar Cayce, it turns out had predicted a hall of records of Atlantis, a chamber under or near the paws of the Sphinx. I knew who Edgar Cayce was. I admit that I wasn't that naive, but I did not know he had predicted halls of records or anything to do about the Sphinx. I'd not read any of the Cayce writings or readings at that point. And I just make that clear because some people have accused me in and out of academia that, I was going there to chase after Cayce and prove him right. No, I didn't care less. In fact, it was sort of embarrassing when this came up. But we'll move on. Something that we wondered was, what was the Sphinx originally? The head, when you look at the head, it is much less weathered. Do you notice that? Than the rest of the body. It's not the original head. There was no doubt in my mind the ancient Egyptians circa 2500 BC were repairing the Sphinx. They put all little blocks along the Sphinx, around the Sphinx, on the paws. When you go to see the Sphinx today, can you see the paws? I would contend no, because they've been covered over with repair blocks. So you're not seeing the original paws. Some of those repair blocks are pretty old, but they're not the original paws. What did they do with the head, though? They recarved it. Was it originally a human or humanoid head? I don't know. The thing that I favored and John Anthony West favored was that it was originally a lion. And we were always thinking a male lion. Why? Leo in the sky, constellations, age of Leo, etc. But then this came out very recently, last year, and the lead author here is Dr. Manu Saifzadeh, who happens to be here, so I can point him out, embarrass him, and he came up with something very, very brilliant, which is that something that had perplexed Egyptologists, and I had heard plenty about, is that the Sphinx is so much older, why are there no textual references to it? I mean, the Egyptians, dynastic Egyptians, they've been using hieroglyphs, etc. Why didn't they ever mention the Sphinx if it's so much older? In fact, this is a problem because they weren't mentioning it a lot in the Old Kingdom either. It turns out it wasn't a Sphinx at the time, and it wasn't a male lion at the time, it was a female lion. It was a lioness. The paper that we put together, Dr. Saifzadeh, Manu, was very generous and brought myself and Robert Bouval on. Everyone, have people heard of Robert Bouval? Yeah, good friend of mine. And I'll come back to him in a minute. But we put together, ultimately, a paper and you can read this. There's a popular article about it on my website, robertschoch.com. There's a link to the original paper, but it's called A New Interpretation of a Rare Old Kingdom Dual Title, The King's Chief Librarian and the Guardian of the Royal Archives of Methi. I think Edgar Cayce would like it, actually. And this is Hemiunu of the 4th dynasty. He was an overseer. He was involved with the Khufu pyramid, the Great Pyramid, attributed to Khufu. And what Dr. Saifzadeh pointed out, can you see his toes there? Cute little toes. But underneath this, there is an inscription. This is a statue of him. There's 7 symbols. And can you see them? Say no. No, not really. That's why I have the next slide. There's his toes. That's why I was pointing out the toes. And you can see there's his symbols. There's an axe, an inkwell and reed, a sedge, a bread loaf, another axe, an unknown rod, a bent rod, and then a lioness. And this is a rendition that Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, did of it. Here we have it, and basically, to make a long story short, this is the lioness. This is in other inscriptions, this is the name of the goddess Methi, who was, in some forms, a guardian goddess. So what's going on here? What is this bent rod? And this is where the brilliance of Manu came in, if I could say it that way, and you'll tell me if I misrepresent anything. He discovered that this is a key. And I'm not talking a metaphorical key or a literary key, it's a literal key, physical key that could go into a lock. So what does this represent? That Methi, is guarding an archive, and there's a key, there's a lock to it. Doesn't that make sense? Once you start to see it, and he, as part of his Hemiunu's title, he was the overseer. He was maybe the physical holder of the key, if you would, or at least held that position. Here are other things that Dr. Saifzadeh found in particular. This goes back to the 31st century. So this is well before when the Sphinx was supposedly carved, according to Egyptologists. Do you see it again? And here's a different form of the key, but you see rising out of the body. And then look at this. Doesn't it look like it's over a building or facade? And this is Tutmosis IV stela between the paws of the Sphinx, erected about 1400 BC. But there you see the Sphinx, and this has eluded many people or been very mysterious. Why is the Sphinx sitting over what looks like a structure? And what I think now is that we can interpret this, overseer of the scribes of the king and master of the key to the lioness, or more, we'll say, fluidly, the king's chief librarian and guardian of the royal archives of Methi. The great Sphinx was originally the lioness Methi, guarding a chamber literally underneath her. And we had already found that back in the early 1990s. And so I'm convinced that there's an archive there. There's a genuine archive. It may contain records, could go back to this earlier period. We just don't know. Would it be important to go in there? I think so. Also, because of rising water tables, etc., it may be flooded now, so it's even more important. Other things. I just started to mention this before, but the repair blocks, these are ancient repair blocks. These are more modern repair blocks. Everyone here, do people know Zai Hawass? Yeah, some of you have heard of him? Yeah. Zai Hawass doesn't agree with me on any of this. Just be fair to him. But he did tell me that these are Old Kingdom blocks. Now, why would they repair it in Old Kingdom times if it had been carved in Old Kingdom times? Why would we have a meter or more erosion on it within maybe 100 or 200 or 300 years, even if these are later Old Kingdom. And I think I've always thought that from a geological point of view, it's quite evident that the core body of the Sphinx goes back to a much earlier period. Initially, I was talking about 5,000 to 7,000 BC because I was trying to push, this was in my younger years, back in the 90s, I was trying to push unconsciously, I realized in hindsight, make it as young as possible so I wouldn't offend anyone too much. It turns out, from the point of view of the Egyptologists and historians in academia, whether I said 5,000 BC or 10,000 BC, they wouldn't make any difference to them anyway. I mean, I was a heretic. Yes, that is exactly it. Right now, as I said, I actually put it back to about 10,000 BC based on analysis of the seismic work. It's interesting that the one criticism I got back in the early 90s when I first presented this, the one criticism I got from my geological colleagues was the very thing that I acknowledge now. They told me, a number of them told me, looking at my raw data, that if anything, I was underestimating the age based on the geological evidence, not overestimating it. And I acknowledge if I went wrong, that's where I went wrong. Other evidence we have right elsewhere in Egypt, I just want to mention two that might that are intriguing. We have the Red Pyramid at Dashur. This was first pointed out by Doug Kenyon, to give credit where credit's due, where it looks like this pyramid, which is older by standard dating than the Great Pyramid, is actually built over a much older structure. Also down in Abydos, we have the Sirion, which is below the New Kingdom level, ground level, and looks very similar to the Valley Temple, which I didn't go into it now because of time constraints, actually is contemporaneous with the core body of the Sphinx, because the major limestone blocks that were used to build this temple were carved out simultaneously with the carving of the body of the Sphinx. We know that geologically. I show this picture, it's an old picture from the late 19th century, just because it shows a view that you can't see to this day because they've excavated more out. Looking at the Red Pyramid, can everyone see how you have a much older weathered structure and then the newer pyramid built on top of it? So I think that what they were doing here was preserving a much earlier structure and building around and over it.